I'm your host, Nick Jikomis, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Alan Davis. Dr. Davis is an associate professor and director for the Center for Psychedelic Drug Research and Education at Ohio State University. And his research is related to exploring the acute and persisting effects of psychoactive substances, examining novel psychological and pharmacological interventions for things like depression, and he's done research with things like psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy for depression. And so we talked a lot about the human clinical experience with psychedelics, including his research on psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. We spent some time at the beginning talking about traditional mainstream approaches to treating things like depression and other psychiatric illnesses. So we talked about psychotherapy and the different forms of psychotherapy that are out there that are commonly used. We talked about things like SSRIs and the traditional mainstream pharmacological or medication-based approaches that are used to treat things like depression. We talked about, how many people those things tend to work for, both alone and in combination. What percentage of people do those things not work for, and why do we think these treatments don't work for everyone? We talked about psychedelics and psilocybin in particular, including some of the research that Professor Davis and others have done around psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. We talked about the ways in which those approaches or those treatments differ from traditional treatments and sort of what the timeline and what the outlook is for things like psilocybin becoming mainstream FDA-approved ways to treat people for things like depression or addiction or other psychiatric illnesses. So if you're interested in psychedelic medicine and psychedelic science, especially as it relates to human clinical research and treating things like depression and other forms of psychiatric illness, this will be a very interesting episode for you. This episode is supported in part by Athletic Greens. Their main product, AG1, is a comprehensive and convenient daily nutrition product containing 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients with less than 1 gram of sugar per serving, no nasty chemicals or artificial anything. It's gluten and dairy free and compatible with paleo, vegan, vegetarian, and ketogenic diets. AG1 is a quick and convenient way to supplement your diet to help ensure your body is getting the nutrients it needs. It comes in powder form, and you can mix it in water and drink it, or you can put it into a smoothie or a shake or something like that. I mix it into water and drink it with the first meal of each day, and it's super convenient. If you go to athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter, Athletic Greens will give you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Their vitamin D product comes in tincture form, so you just take 1 drop each day. A large fraction of the population is actually vitamin D deficient, especially in winter months when we get less sun exposure, and vitamin D is super important for the proper function of the immune system and for a variety of other things. And there's even evidence indicating that vitamin D deficiency is correlated with more severe cases of COVID-19 in those who get infected. Every time I go into the doctor each year for a checkup, I'm always told that vitamin D deficiency is very common and I should be supplementing on a daily basis. So visit athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter or click the link in the episode description. You'll get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D with your first purchase. Hey everyone, I want to take a minute to tell you about a really cool health monitoring device I've been using for several weeks. It's called Lumen, and it's a handheld, pocket-sized device with a sleek design. It measures CO2 levels in your breath, which allows their technology to determine the extent to which your body is burning fats versus carbohydrates. Lumen helps improve your metabolic flexibility, your body's efficiency in shifting between using fats and carbs. It improves your ability to burn fat, which decreases your hunger levels and makes your body less dependent on snacking, and it can increase your energy levels by helping you develop a high-functioning metabolism. I use this device in the morning, before bed, and after meals and workouts to track my metabolism. With just a couple weeks of use, I learned a lot about which foods were causing my body to burn mostly fat, mostly carbs, or both, as well as how long I need to fast each day to promote fat burning. Lumen is great for anyone looking to optimize their health for either weight loss or athletic performance. The easy-to-use app allows you to track your results together with what you're eating and how you're exercising, and it syncs with other devices like the Apple Watch. Click the link in the episode description to learn more and use the code MIND, M-I-N-D, in all capital letters to get $50 off your Lumen device today.
Thanks for having me.
Can you start off by just telling everyone a little bit about who you are and what kind of research you do?
Certainly, I'm a clinical psychologist, but I find myself have trained in psychiatry as well as social work. I'm actually currently a director of the Center for Psychedelic Drug Research and Education, an associate professor in the College of Social Work at Ohio State University. I also have an appointment as a faculty member at Johns Hopkins in psychiatry, as well as in the psychiatry department at OSU. So I kind of find myself working largely in interdisciplinary spaces, mostly focused on the topic of psychedelic therapies, running clinical trials, examining the safety and efficacy of this treatment for people with depression, and most recently for veterans with PTSD, and looking to advance the work in underrepresented folks as well.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about psilocybin and psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, but I also want to sort of give people a foundation in terms of, why that research is being done and how it compares to more traditional or widespread treatment options. So for something like depression, say, what are the major forms of psychotherapy that are used, and sort of how do they work and how effective are they?
So for the current treatments that are out there, mostly people can think of them as within two camps, one being psychotherapies. So talking to a therapist about issues related to mood or behavior. And then there's also medication, psychopharmacology. So there are largely antidepressant. Most people are familiar with at least the term SSRI, or some are known as SNRIs. But those two types of treatments are about equally effective on their own. So, not everyone will respond to therapy. Not everyone will respond to medications. Some people find one a better path than the other. Both are about equally effective. They work in about, let's say 30 to 50% of people. However, they don't work for everyone. They're better when they are used together. So someone who both is in therapy and on an SSRI is typically going to do better than if they're on any one of those treatments alone. But they're not meeting the need that people have. And I think in part it's because both currently take an approach of kind of reducing down into, kind of a theoretical component, what the understanding of a mental health problem is. So for SSRIs, the idea is that, well, there must be an imbalance in serotonin. And so if we give this medication, it's going to correct this imbalance, and then we're going to, make people feel better. Well, the reason that doesn't work is because that doesn't really take into account all of the other factors that make people depressed, like, living in a, oppressive system and a society and an environment that doesn't really lend itself well to, promoting mental health being, just one of those factors. So yeah, there's a number of things that kind of get in the way of how helpful they are, but they do work for some people. So yeah, it's kind of a starting point to try, but then we need to find more options.
And when you say that psychotherapy and medication using something like SSRIs work in about 30 to 50% of people for each one, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean 30 to 50% of people who try one of those are going to see some improvement? Does that mean that they go into complete remission with their depression? What actually constitutes an improvement there?
So typically a improvement is going to mean just any kind of reduction in symptoms. So there's two ways that is measured. One is called a response. A clinical response is at least a 50% reduction in the intensity of your depression symptoms or any other kind of mental health symptom. Or there's remission, where your symptoms drop below the line kind of necessary for it being like a diagnosable condition. So, the overall effect of SSRIs is kind of a moderate effect. So it's not big, it's not large, it's not small, but it varies somewhere between that kind of, 30 to 50 or 40 to 60%. But in terms of getting people all the way to a remission place where they're no longer able to be diagnosed because, it's working so well, that's probably on the lower end of about 30%.
I see. And are there any clear patterns in terms of like who that 30% is? Do the 30% of people where they go into complete remission or they have very significant symptom reduction, do they share anything in common, or is it sort of impossible to predict ahead of time if someone's going to respond that way?
That's a great question. And I unfortunately don't know that level of detail about antidepressant medication. I do think that there is some evidence to suggest that it's probably folks where the hypothesis about what is contributing to the depression, meaning that, with giving a medication, the hypothesis is that there's a chemical imbalance in the brain that needs to be corrected, right? So that 30% of people that are able to achieve remission are probably people who are as close as possible to that hypothesis being accurate for them. And there are a variety of reasons that depression exists. And this chemical, this biological basis is really just one of those factors. Like as I mentioned earlier, the environment is equally important to why people have mental health problems as these biological characteristics. There are also a variety of traumatic and stressful things that happen to people in their lives that, kind of broadly a part of that environment as well. So medications aren't going to treat that. Medications aren't going to take someone out of poverty, for example. Medications aren't going to, alleviate someone being in an abusive relationship, right? So I would say that it's more likely the case that those 30% are probably kind of purists, so to speak, in terms of like maybe they have a supportive environment. Otherwise, they have, resources. They're probably more resourced in terms of housing and food stability and other things, and are probably as close to possible as that chemical imbalance being like maybe the most important factor for them, would be my guess. I really can't speak to whether or not that's been like rigorously tested empirically, but that would be my theoretical guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, two things come to mind there. One would be, even if someone is close to this sort of theoretical serotonin imbalance idea, let's just assume that's true for some people. If a change in the balance of something like a neurotransmitter like serotonin is an important component of depression, and that's sort of an outcome of the inputs that are causing that depression, simply fixing that, but not taking them out of whatever environment is producing the inputs that cause the depression and the imbalance or whatever. Treating them with something like an SSRI might fix that sort of endpoint, but if they don't actually change their environment, you're constantly having the same inputs that are going to feed into that, so that if you go off the medication or you stop psychotherapy, you're just going to revert back. The other thing that comes to mind that I would just love to get your basic thoughts on is, I mean, the brain is obviously very, very complicated. There's, I don't think anyone seriously believes that, depression is ever caused by only something like serotonin being out of balance. There's lots and lots of factors. And I think
except for the pharmaceutical industry, who would like to convince you of that.
yeah. But, there's so many, psychiatric illness in particular, when you're talking about the brain, it's so complicated that, you can have the same thing in two different people, say major depressive disorder, and it could have, a partially or even a completely different underlying, biological cause. And I would imagine that that's also a factor here. One person's depression might look on the surface like another's, but the biological causes of that could be very different.
Yeah, and not only can the biological causes be diverse and varied, but obviously the environments can be diverse and varied, and the symptoms can be interpreted differently depending on one's culture, depending on one's insight of their own kind of physiological, experience in life, the way that they think, and so the way that the information that comes back to them when they talk about their experiences with people like loved ones and others, and it's like each individual's experience of their depression or their PTSD or whatever the condition is will be filtered through all of these different lenses. And so it's really difficult, if not impossible, to really even have a diagnostic category like major depressive disorder and have any confidence at all that we're actually, meaningfully diagnosing and measuring and understanding a condition in any more than one person at a time, if that makes sense. Like it's to me, the whole pursuit of a diagnostic classification system is a misrepresentation of the idiosyncrasies of which mental health problems come up to begin with.
I mean, I think it's so hard for anyone to even just speak about their feelings, their subjective experience, the way that different people talk about it. They might be having the same phenomenology in their experience, but they describe it in two different ways just because they have, a different vocabulary and and it's so sort of, these things are so sort of ephemeral and amorphous, just intrinsically. The other thing is, I think for most psychiatric illness, right, there are no actual like objective tests. There's no you can't get blood work and know that you've got depression or something like that. Is that something you also think about, or that the field of psychiatry and clinical psychology thinks about, like developing ways to assess someone's psychiatric condition without relying solely on the words they use to self-report?
Yes, and not only has it been of interest, but billions of dollars have been put into into research looking at the biological basis of these conditions with frankly very little outcome that's led to a clear ability to do something like a blood test or a genetic test and have any kind of understanding. I think there's some benefit that's come from that research, but that research has largely been designed with this kind of like reductionistic classification lens, right? Where they want to get to a point where they can say, okay, well, now we've found the biomarker for depression, as if that biomarker exists solely within the body, that it's definable and that it will kind of apply cross-culturally and even within culture across individuals. And to me, that's the same farce that has led to having antidepressant medication as a treatment for people, right? The medication is not actually solving the problem of depression. For some people who are in remission, who will take that medication for the rest of their life, who will deal with the side effects of that medication and will deal with a variety of other things that come up because of having to take that medication for the rest of their lives, for some people they are in remission. But that does not mean that like any of this approach is actually leading towards healing of what that depressed state is.
And so if it's roughly 30 to 50%, give or take, of people with something like depression will respond to some degree from taking something like an SSRI. How many of those people have side effects that are either chronic while they're on it or that persist after the medication stops? So, even for the 30 to 50% where it works to some extent, does it work and they're better to some extent, or do some significant proportion of them also have other things that go wrong because of the medication?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of people that have side effects from medication. That's one of the reasons why people don't stay on them. It's one of the reasons why the efficacy rates are so low, is because people find them intolerable. They deal, depending on the medication, it obviously varies on what people might experience as a side effect, but it's everything from nausea and vomiting and diarrhea to weight gain and feeling like you're empty inside, or feeling, more anxious, nervous. Some people will have, major side effects into their sexual functioning, typically as a reduction in sexual desire or difficulty orgasming, and people will have increase in appetite, which of course contributes to weight gain. So there's just there's so many side effects for all of these different medications that have been developed, and a lot of people really struggle with them.
And are all of those like acute side effects that they have when they're on the medication? Are there any that can, because there's a lot of people that are on SSRIs for years, sometimes many years. Mm-hmm. And then if those people stop, are there any side effects is there anything about their biology that it changes, that has an enduring change that sort of never goes back?
Yeah, I'm not sure entirely about that question, but I will say just anecdotally from people that I've worked with, some of them who have come into the psilocybin clinical trials, who have been on medications for a really long time, they do describe a kind of overall dampening of their emotional connection to things. And I think that there is some emerging evidence showing that the longer someone's been on an SSRI, there's also like a potential dampening of like things like the psychedelic experience, and which I think kind of goes to this notion that the brain might be, I hate to use the word forever, it might be changed for a while, that persists beyond just discontinuing that medication, just because of how long the brain has kind of been in this medicated state.
And so on the psychotherapy side, so if someone goes in for talk therapy, what are the major sort of forms or strategies of psychotherapy? Like I know there's cognitive behavioral therapy and there's other forms of therapy. What are the big ones there? And do they have different levels of effectiveness? Why are some more popular than others? Like what are the major forms of psychotherapy?
There are several. There's been kind of waves of psychotherapy development over time. Some of the early treatments that are pretty effective are called behavioral therapies. One is called behavioral activation, in particular for depression, which is really about kind of getting active, getting the body moving, that kind of just engaging in behaviors that can reinforce, physical activity, kind of things like working out, going to the gym, going on a walk, things that can activate one socially, kind of getting engaged with, friends, with a community. That, this type of behavioral activation has been shown to be an effective strategy to help with depression. Since then, things like cognitive behavioral therapy, which really just adds into that behavioral component, also this understanding that the mind, one's thoughts also affect one's emotions. So it's not just behavior, it's behavior, thoughts, and emotions that as like a triad can kind of, at any one of those places can kind of create a chain of depressed thoughts or anxious thoughts that can also give kind of a place to intervene at any of those levels. So something like, someone having a depressed thought, there's strategies that can be used to kind of help deal with that. There's a newer wave of treatments that are also available now called mindfulness-based therapies. There's one called acceptance and commitment therapy that has gained quite a bit of popularity. All of these, what we're calling third wave therapies, all of these third wave therapies really are an integration of mindfulness, understanding more of kind of an Eastern approach to mental health and well-being, things like meditation and awareness of breath and body. And that these approaches, when you combine them within this kind of CBT space, that the combination of these things seem to be helpful for people. But what we know from decades of research on any of these treatments, especially those treatments where they're actually compared to each other, is that they're all about the same in terms of how well they work. They work, for some, they don't work for everyone. They're also, pretty expensive to get into therapy, to have the type of resources that allow one to do this for months, typically, if not longer. And so they're about as effective as the antidepressants out there. They're more effective if you're doing both at the same time. There's kind of an added advantage there. But probably what's the biggest thing that we've learned from the research on psychotherapy is it's about fit. It's about the fit between what's the right person, what's their approach, what kind of therapist are they working with? Is that therapist, is it a good approach for them? How well does that fit together? That match is what typically is going to be shown to be effective for an individual, which is hard because there's a lot of therapists out there that are doing a lot of different things, and people don't often know that they can go into a therapist and like interview them, right? And kind of want to assess, like as a customer, want to assess the fit and want to assess the treatment that's being, offered to them. And for some reasons, because people just don't know that there are different treatments or there are, different approaches, but it is about that fit. And it's also about the relationship. So we know from a lot of research that the what we call the therapeutic alliance, or the kind of safety and the connection that people feel with developing, trust in a provider, with developing trust in a therapist, that kind of becomes a safe space for them to explore the dark and squishy parts of themselves that they don't necessarily feel comfortable sharing with everybody, that relationship is also really effective in and of itself, regardless of what treatment's being provided to somebody. That just having that safety and that space and that trust can also help people feel better.
And so psychedelics and psilocybin-assisted therapy been getting a lot of attention over the past few years. I know that you've been involved in some of those trials. Can you just kind of give us a state of the art for psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy for things like depression? What does the totality of the clinical research say today? Would you say it's proven that psilocybin is effective at some level? Where are the clinical trials at in terms of, phase 2, 3, 4, and all of that? So just where are we today with that?
So we are, I would say, at the late stage of all of the research that will need to take place before the FDA will have enough information to decide whether or not it should be made available to the public. That phase of research that we're in is called phase 3, and that's the last phase where a treatment is explored, typically at multiple sites around the country or the world, in hundreds of people, as opposed to these smaller studies that are only done in dozens. Excuse me. And that research is largely pointing towards the likelihood of approval by FDA and probably the European Medicines Agency as well within the next, I would say, 12 to 18 months. So we're pretty close. Of course, nothing scientifically is ever definitive. So I can't say for certain whether that data will lead to approval. But it seems like there's the writing's on the wall to some extent. And the reason I say that is because of not only the preliminary evidence that's being published, over the last few years, but also because, the FDA has signaled to the Biden administration that the likelihood of approval for psychedelic medicines is, strong, and that they're not too far in the future. And so because of that, there's actually been a federal task force that has been initiated at this point to bring together all the different stakeholders at the federal level who would be involved in overseeing this type of dissemination of a treatment. So people at the DEA obviously are involved in this conversation. The people at Department of Health and Human Services who oversee things like Medicaid and Medicare and overall kind of guidance around treatments that should be covered by those nationalized healthcare system. People at the VA. So there's a lot of stakeholders involved in these conversations, and my guess is that those conversations would not have been initiated if we weren't at some level of certainty that there's enough evidence already to suggest that psilocybin therapy is going to be at least an effective option for some people.
And what basic results have people seen so far in trials for psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy for depression in terms of, what are the effect sizes? Is it working for a similar percentage to like the 30 to 50% we see for SSRIs? Is it working for more people? Is it working for people who SSRIs didn't help their depression? Like what kind of effects are we seeing?
So it does vary a little bit by study. So I'll try to do my best to summarize. But in general, what we're seeing is that there is a larger proportion of people in these studies who are in complete remission from depression. In our study that we completed at Johns Hopkins, which was the first randomized controlled trial looking at comparing psilocybin therapy to a waitlist, no treatment group, was that 50% of the people that were in that study were in complete remission at 1 month after the treatment was over. Now, keep in mind that, 50%, it's still larger than the 30% in remission, from antidepressants or psychotherapy, but it also only took, 2 doses of psilocybin in conjunction with about 13 hours of therapy. So 1 treatment package, 2 doses of a medication, and 50% of people were in remission. What was really interesting is that at 1 year later, after the treatment was over, that 50% of people were still in remission. So these are folks who often had been on a variety of other medications, had tried psychotherapies, had been through the gamut, so to speak, of other approaches, and either found them to be not as successful as they needed them to be. So maybe they had some benefit, but not completely, or they were dealing with side effects that they didn't like, or for some, the treatments never helped. So that's pretty remarkable in and of itself, just to kind of see that on some of the other larger studies that have been conducted now, comparing both to placebo as well as other treatments like SSRIs. We see that in one of those studies, there was on almost all indications of looking at the variety of ways you can measure depression. On almost all of them, they showed that psilocybin therapy had a favorable treatment profile compared to SSRIs, with the exception of this one measure that was kind of their official measure of symptoms, which subsequently now there's been some interesting studies looking at whether that measure was actually appropriate to use as that comparison. And yeah, but in any event, the reason I bring that up is because there's likely to be some diminishing effect as we get into these bigger studies, as we compare to placebo, as we have hundreds, if not thousands of people that are eventually treated in these studies. I think we're going to see that it's maybe not as high as 50% remission, in part just because, those studies that are so small, they're so selective to get into them. It's very narrow in terms of the type of people that are in those kinds of studies. And so similar to how we have people who don't have just like a purely biological basis of depression, right? And we kind of, as you disseminate treatments out into the real world to real people who are not so selectively, chosen, we're likely to see some diminishing in that. It's likely though that it's still at least as effective as other options, if not probably more effective than other options.
Yeah, and I imagine that's typical, right? As you progress with the phase 1, 2, 3 trials, they get bigger, and you're casting a wider net, and that's probably common, right? That the sort of effect size is probably diminished somewhat as you go through that progression.
Absolutely. So it's definitely expected with every treatment as it reaches a broader and broader sample of people that have been tested, and again, even when it goes from testing to implementation, you're certainly going to see some diminishment of effect there as well as it gets to like the biggest potential population. At the same time, even if we end up in a place where we can say statistically or scientifically that it's the same effectiveness as other treatments, it still only takes 2 doses of the substance. It has a much more favorable side effect profile. It leads to other really important things that people talk about in terms of their identity development and understanding their relationships better, moving towards things that are important to them in their life. So even outside of symptom reduction, this treatment provides a whole range of other types of enduring effects that people find desirable and important. And I think that that's very unique to this type of treatment. So even if it's only as effective as other treatments, it still seems like for some people it might be a much better option.
Yeah, I mean, it is remarkable that you see this kind of effect from just 2 doses of something in the context of several weeks of psychotherapy. So for the trials that have been done or that you've been involved with, are the people that are willing and able to do the psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, are these typically people that have tried other things and it hasn't worked, so they're just really hoping that something new will work? Or like, and sort of the other thing that's related to that, I guess, is how many of these people are completely naive to psychedelics and have never tried them before? How many of them had previous experience with psychedelics? And what's your sense for what chunk of the patient population is going to be excited to try something like this if other things have failed, and what percentage might be intimidated and wouldn't want to go through something like this?
So most of the studies that have been completed specifically with folks that are considered treatment resistant, which means that they've tried at least 1, sometimes 2 or more other treatments, and the treatments have not been successful. That's not the case for every study. Like our depression study at Hopkins, we didn't require that they had that background. But I think because of the nature of these studies right now, the nature of them being highly experimental, they're using a psychedelic, which has a whole, stigmatized background in people's minds about what psychedelics are. Because of all of that, we're still typically seeing, even when it's not a requirement, that most people in the studies have had several medication trials in the past. It has not worked for them. And so they find their way into these studies as kind of like a last hope, of trying to find something that will work for them. And so, but in terms of the kind of the folks that this, I'm sorry, I'm kind of losing track a little bit on what the second part or third part of your question was. Maybe you could repeat it if you'd like.
Oh, yeah, I was just asking, are there differences between people who have previous experience with psychedelics versus those that don't? And, what's your general sense of, what percentage of people say are going to be interested in trying something like this versus those that, might be intimidated by the nature of a psychedelic assisted psychotherapy?
So most of the studies have a requirement that people have to have limited exposures to psychedelics prior to coming in the study. Usually what that means is that no exposure to psychedelics in the last 5 years, and there's a preference for really none ever, ideally. But if it's more than 5 years ago and it, was kind of like more like a recreational experience, it wasn't really done for the intention of a therapeutic experience, or even if it was, but it didn't lead to like any kind of measurable important changes or something like that, then people can get into the studies. But it really is trying to minimize, knowing that this is potentially the first time someone has been exposed to a psychedelic.
So in general, it sounds like the majority of patients that have gone through the trials that have been done so far are often treatment resistant. So they've tried other things, at least one other thing before, and the majority of them are also have limited to no history with psychedelics.
Typically, that's probably a typical profile. Or if they have had experience with psychedelics, it's been, in their, years, if not decades ago. It was kind of like a blip of experimentation or something like that. But it wasn't like they were continuing to use psychedelics into adulthood or things like that. So typically that's, I would say, a pretty common profile in the studies. However, there are some folks who, especially on the history of depression side, there are some folks who have not tried treatments before, especially in our study at Hopkins, as I mentioned, that we had several people in that study who had not tried anything in terms of treatments before that. So it's not the entire, encapsulation of folks, but that's a good general swath. So I think in terms of like the latter part of your question about, are there going to be people who are afraid of this treatment or who are going to have thoughts about it? I mean, absolutely. I mean, people have thoughts about it now for sure. There's people who, are out there who I'm sure have, for the last, 4 or 5 decades been, living in a misinformation campaign about psychedelics, from all levels of government and education spaces. So, that unfortunately that misinformation campaign has done a lot of damage to helping people understand what these substances are, their history, their long term, in most cases, history of use in indigenous communities for things like treatment and rites of passage and at different parts of the developmental trajectory in people's lives, that these medicines have been used, far longer than the Western research has been going on. So, but that information and that understanding and that contextualization and really the absence of any cultural container or context in the US for psychedelics as a result of that has led to people being afraid of these substances and people worrying about the potential risks that might be involved. There's been just like fabricated lies told to them for so long that, you just start to believe the lies after a period of time.
And, in terms of the subjective experience, when people go through these therapy sessions that are assisted with psilocybin, obviously everyone's going to have their own unique experience, and no two experiences are going to be identical or even similar. But, in terms of the people that go into complete remission, 6 to 12 months out, and those that don't really see response, are there any kind of common threads in terms of how they report their experiences being? Do the people who go into remission report a better, less terrifying experience or a stronger experience? Are there any patterns there?
So there are some patterns that have emerged. I mean, we know that some of the acute effects of psychedelics, things like the insight component, getting a new understanding, a new realization or awareness of something about yourself, about things that you've struggled with, about relationships or things in your life that are difficult, that those insights, and those new understandings can be incredibly powerful and are often correlated pretty strongly with mental health improvements. The mystical or spiritual experience is another acute effect that there's evidence to suggest that these spiritual moments in the psychedelic experience can also be helpful. They can be impactful. For some, it's described as, one of the single most or top 5 spiritually significant and psychologically insightful experience of their entire life. And so the impact of that type of experience can certainly not only mathematically or statistically be related to outcome, but I think it's just in general related to why people's perspectives have shifted and changed in terms of how they view themselves, how they view the world around them, and also, how their mental health shifts and changes as a result. But there's also, a variety of biological things that are happening in the brain. We know that for people who are depressed, the part of the brain that is kind of interacts with that depression that will overreact when it sees negative emotional things in the environment, that will kind of reinforce this depressive state, this depressive kind of attitude, because it's lighting up when it sees someone frowning on one side of the street as opposed to someone smiling on the other side. It's taking that information, and the brain is it's substantiating their depression, right? Oh yeah, it is, life does suck because look, this person's unhappy, right? That part of the brain when you have exposure to psilocybin therapy, that part of the brain reacts differently after the therapy is completed. It does not respond as strongly to that negative emotional information in the environment. And so, just the fact that the brain is changing in how it responds to things going on around the individual, helps us to see that it's not just someone's, trip, although the trip seems to be important and helpful for people. But it also seems to be there's just like biological changes happening at the level of the neuron and the synapse in the brain that might also be contributing to this benefit. So, and there's a lot more that we're just starting to better understand. There's experiences of difficult physiological experiences that people sometimes feel as like a release of some kind, an energetic release of some kind. Some people talk about emotional catharsis and ego dissolution and a variety of other things that we're really just starting to tap into to better understand how it's related. But any of these types of things, any of these types of experiences seem to be potentially helpful for people.
In terms of the enduring effects. So you mentioned that in some of these studies, they followed up with patients 6 to 12 months after they did psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, and a significant proportion of them were still in remission, which is great news. What's the longest anyone's ever looked out? Is it 12 months or is it even longer?
My understanding is that the study that we did at Hopkins with a 12-month follow-up is the longest that's been published so far on folks with depression. I do believe that there are some studies that are trying to look beyond that now. We're actually at Hopkins, we're trying to do a 4-year follow-up of all of those people who participated in that study, just to see it, at 3 to 4 years out, how does it look now, this far out. So we'll kind of know, hopefully by the end of this year, or early next year, what the results are from that. But as far as I know, that 12 months is the farthest out that studies have published on the topic of how enduring those effects have been. And in that study, we found that, still about half were in remission. And we also found, even at 12 months out, that people were reporting that, that experience was still one of the most personally meaningful, experiences of their life. And so I think that, it led to a lot of other things besides just, for some, an antidepressant effect. For some, it also led to new meaning and purpose.
And so what are there any enduring or lasting side effects? Do people report any type of physiological change or anything else that outlast the treatment itself?
So some of the most common side effects are things like transient anxiety that can happen especially during the onset phase of the psychedelic experience. For some people, that can be really difficult. There can be panic, there can be fear and anxiety. It's one of the reasons why we do so much therapy ahead of time and why there's trained professionals in the room with someone when we do this treatment, is to help manage some of that. One of the other really common side effects is headache that comes usually later in the day of the session, sometimes over the following night or evening. But outside of that, there are very few, and as far as I can tell, no serious side effects for people. Now, that's also taking into consideration, a very careful selection process into these studies. And so when you look at just people using psychedelics out in the real world, outside of therapeutic context, there is a small but still, meaningful risk for, enduring problems related to, people have probably heard of like people having a bad trip. People have probably heard that there are people who struggle with, some of the psychedelic effects that come back even after they've come down from the trip. And sometimes those lingering effects, like still seeing things moving in the visual field, or still feeling kind of unsettled, or kind of feeling some of the things they felt during, that panic or fear place of the psychedelic state. Sometimes for those people, there are some people who develop what's called HPPD, which is this kind of long-term, ongoing, kind of continued experience of these kind of negative psychedelic effects. It's a really rare condition. It's estimated it's less than 1% of people who have develop this type of complication. And so far that has not happened at all. It's been 0% in the clinical trials, but in part because we're screening people out who might potentially be at risk for that. So people who have like a history of, psychosis in their family, who have, potentially like a predisposition to having some of those challenges, are weeded out of the studies. So, overall, there's, I think, very few, risks involved in actually, if you're carefully screened, if you're carefully prepared, if you're working with trained professionals, but there are risks that are there, and some of the risks that are there, even when we do such careful selection and screening, are there's risk to kind of being vulnerable to suggestions, of being vulnerable in a psychedelic state to things that people might not otherwise consent to. So there's been some studies that there's been some question about what kind of therapy was provided, whether or not the providers of those therapies were acting in ethical ways in terms of things like touch during a session, or kind of how they engaged physically with an individual. And there's even been some cases reported, in some studies, of sexual abuse. And so there are absolutely, and I'm not just talking about psilocybin, I'm talking about just like psychedelic therapy, generally speaking right now. There are risks involved with people being in a vulnerable state that don't necessarily have anything to do with the side effects of the medication, but just have to do with like being in this kind of really intensely vulnerable space with other people.
And in terms of the psychotherapy side of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, there's several weeks of therapy that are surrounding the usually 2 doses of psilocybin that people get. Is this a new form of therapy that's very specific to these studies, or is it basically one of the standard forms of therapy like CBT or something? What does the actual talk therapy side of this look like?
So the therapy that's provided is in some ways kind of unique, because part of the therapy is preparing someone for a psychedelic experience. So, that certainly is something unique to this type of approach. And we spend many hours with people talking through kind of all the different types of things that might happen during the psychedelic experience, and also helping to prepare them with skills, things they can use and do to navigate that psychedelic space. So that is obviously unique to this approach. But there's other things that we're doing as well that are not unique to this approach. Connecting with people in the therapy also means, talking about things like their emotions and their behaviors and their thoughts, and talking about things like mindfulness and things that, as I mentioned earlier, are kind of featured in a variety of different therapeutic approaches. So for some studies, they're actually tying together the components that are specific to psilocybin therapy and, measurable components of official other therapies. So there are some studies that are using a acceptance and commitment therapy approach, and there's some studies who are using motivational interviewing or cognitive behavioral therapy, and they're really doing a full therapeutic package that you would otherwise see kind of in a study just of that therapy. And they're kind of tying that, embedding that within, this other kind of psychoeducational component for preparing people for psychedelic experiences. And there's a lot of studies that aren't, tying a specific therapy, that they're kind of maybe doing a little bit more of an eclectic or integrative approach. But I would say that most studies are using some, mix of both kind of what we already know is helpful from other therapies and kind of tying that into this newer approach for psychedelics.
And I mean, there's a lot of different psychedelics and other psychoactives being investigated for all sorts of different stuff now: depression, addiction, other things. I know that you've done some work sort of comparing and contrasting some of these drugs. So I know that you've looked at psilocybin versus things like 5-MeO-DMT. And so what have you seen there so far in terms of what are the major differences there, both in terms of subjective effects, the length or duration of the effects, and what do we think might be relevant there in terms of, therapeutic potential?
So, there are a variety of differences with psychedelics. They're broadly classified in the same group, but they can be very different depending on the context that people are in and the type of substance they've consumed. For comparing something like 5-MeO-DMT to psilocybin, one of the biggest differences is the duration of effect. So 5-MeO-DMT typically lasts somewhere on the average of like 20 to 40 minutes, depending on the how it's consumed or how it's put into the body. When it's smoked or inhaled, it's much shorter duration. When it's injected intramuscularly or kind of evaluated in a slower way into the body, the effects are longer. But it's still, less than 45 minutes compared to psilocybin, which is 4 to 6 hours, and that's compared to something like LSD that's 10 to 12 hours. So there are obviously a variety of the ways in which the duration of these effects can be different, and because of that duration and the way in which things, there's the time course that people have in these experiences, there's also differences in the way that the kind of effects will fluctuate, that people might have a variety of different types of experiences with psilocybin that kind of ebb and flow, as the substance is moving its way through the body. But with 5-MeO-DMT, there's just such a narrow window of time to have any experience that it often just like comes on. There's like one experience and then it kind of comes down, as opposed to psilocybin where it might come in waves. There might be like an overall wave of effect that kind of reaches a peak and subsides, but there might be like kind of additional waves that kind of come and go, especially throughout the latter hours of the experience. In terms of the differences in the acute effects, I mean, those vary so much just even within substance by everything that relates to the individual who's consumed it and the environment that they're in and the preparation that they've had and their cultural contextualization. So there's so much just inter-drug differences. So it's hard to compare them directly in terms of the subjective effects. Although one of the biggest differences with something like 5-MeO-DMT is that it doesn't seem to have as much visual phenomenology as other psychedelics. So it seems to be potentially more emotional and psychologically psychedelic as opposed to visually, but seems to have equal, if not greater, intensity of reported effects in other ways in terms of the emotional catharsis that people report experiencing, or these really deep, mystical and spiritual or insightful experiences that people report. So yeah, there's some overlapping things across these substances, but also a lot of, just a lot of differences.
And so based on your experience with some of these trials and everything that you've done, there's a big question, in the field of psychedelic science, generally speaking, around, whether or not the subjective effects are therapeutically relevant or even, potentially unnecessary, or whether they're just, basically a side effect. And there might be an ability to create derivatives of existing psychedelics that have the benefits around, generating the clinical outcomes we want, but that don't require tripping at all, or at least less than something like psilocybin or DMT or whatever. Based on your clinical experience on the clinical side here, do you think it's likely that such drugs will be created? Do you think that the subjective effects are likely involved in the therapeutic outcomes here, or are they plausibly irrelevant?
As someone who's provided this treatment to people and seen firsthand the importance and the relevance of those subjective effects, it's hard for me to imagine that stripping those away would otherwise still make it effective. At the same time, as a scientist, I wouldn't rule it out. I just know that I haven't seen that work yet. So it'll be curious to see with some of those studies, whether or not they're able to demonstrate that it can be as effective. I still think that people should have if nothing else, have the option and the opportunity to choose the fit that's the best fit for them. It might be the case that maybe for those people who aren't in remission, from the typical psychedelic therapy approach, perhaps those people, maybe the acute effects were distracting or, otherwise were confusing and led to, difficulty in integrating the experience. We've had some people who could make no sense of what happened to them in the psychedelic experience, and it was kind of distressing and difficult. And so, for those people, maybe a better fit would be to then try a psychedelic without, the acute effects and to see if that was helpful for them. But for others, there's such important meaning making that comes from these acute experiences that, I would hate to see that stripped away from the model completely. So hopefully it's a both and a situation in the future. There's going to be some people who are just terrified of psychedelics and the experiences that they've heard people have. And for those people, it might be better that they have an option that still potentially brings them relief, but obviates some of that anxiety. So yeah, I hope to see a place for both approaches. but my current experience seeing people, with these experiences is that to remove that completely would be missing the point.
Mhm. And what are your thoughts around microdosing? My understanding is that for psilocybin and most other things that have been studied clinically, typically or pretty much every time we're talking about large or fully psychedelic doses. Has anyone done clinical trials for psilocybin or anything else at very low doses? And just what are your thoughts generally around this increasingly popular phenomenon of microdosing?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that the idea is a fascinating one, that somehow subperceptual doses of a psychedelic might still contribute to improvements in mental health and just overall well-being. It's really intriguing. And I think that there's enough anecdotal reports out there of people who are reporting benefits in this way that it certainly deserves, really, robust scientific experimentation to understand it better. However, the current studies that have been done on the topic have largely shown that it's probably a placebo effect, that they haven't been able to discern. Again, it's only been a couple studies, so there's more needs to be done. But at least in these early studies, they've shown that there really is no difference between placebo and people who are getting the microdose. That being said, there's something to be said about the placebo effect is not a bad thing, right? There's a lot of things that affect people's experiences in life. And if you told me that I could take a microdose of something and I had, let's say a 30% chance that it was going to improve my life, and it might just be because my brain is really powerful and might be driving that change, okay, if there's no risks involved, then why not? Because that's still an improvement and a betterment of someone's well-being in life because they're, engaged in this behavior. But whether it actually means that microdosing is effective for that, I think, the science is so far pointing to maybe not. But again, we haven't been able to because there hasn't been funding to do it yet. There hasn't been large studies on this topic that have really started to dig into this experimentally. So I think we need more studies to know for sure. But, it's question about whether or not it's actually working.
And, around the question of placebos here, when we're doing trials for things like psilocybin, where, we're using a full dose, so the effects are quite potent and very noticeable. What are the placebos that are actually used, and how does the question of placebos and blinding how do you think about that when you're talking about something like a psychedelic where the effects are just so obvious, subjectively obvious, that it's difficult to think about what a true placebo would even look like here?
Yeah, it's a concern for this type of research. It's something that has been touted as almost like a deal breaker in terms of really understanding from the kind of gold standard scientific lens of really understanding the true efficacy of this approach, because it's very difficult to mask people to condition. It's very difficult to be blinded, both as the person receiving the psychedelic or the placebo and as the experimenter, right? It's hard for us to be blinded as to what people have gotten. Although I will say, not impossible. There's absolutely been times where people have been given a placebo and it's fooled. People thought they got the drug, and also the experimenters thought they got the drug, and it wasn't revealed till later that they didn't. So that expectation, that expectancy of what people think is going to happen, the placebo effect, is real with this drug as well. But most people are functionally unblinded. Most people know they haven't gotten the psychedelic. Most therapists know that their participant hasn't gotten it. So it's an issue. But to me, it's actually the bigger issue that this brings up is not whether or not we'll be able to, have enough evidence to determine whether or not it should be made available to the public. I mean, I think the writing's on the wall in that regard. I think regardless of this issue with blinding, the placebo-controlled studies are still showing that there's, an effect of the treatment, and likely that will be enough for FDA approval. I think the bigger issue that it's bringing up is actually the inadequacy of our scientific system and the inadequacy of thinking that the placebo-controlled trial should be the end-all be-all of experimental manipulation. And I think that actually this is a really good example of us needing to, as scientists and as a culture that kind of revolves around science as a way of knowledge formation, that we actually need to think about what other ways of knowing, what other ways of understanding things is equally or potentially, just in this case, better suited to help us understand the questions that we're asking in these studies. And so I think for me, it just calls into question the adequacy of the system that we're in, and how we need to probably find better and just better alternatives for this type of study.
And approximately how many phase 3 trials are ongoing for psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, and what are the key next steps that need to happen to trigger the FDA issuing an official opinion, and approximately how long do we think that's going to take?
So as far as I know, there are two, and possibly a third, but for sure two phase 3 trials that are either underway or soon to be underway. One is being led by the Sona Institute here in the US. They're pursuing psilocybin therapy for major depressive disorder. There's another one being pursued by a company in the UK called Compass. Compass is pursuing it, a psilocybin therapy for treatment-resistant depression. Both of those studies and both of those trajectories of studies have already received what's considered a breakthrough therapy designation by the FDA, which means that a few years ago, based on the evidence at the time, the FDA already said, this is already something that should be fast-tracked. This is something that needs to have special FDA oversight because the evidence at the time was already so strong, which is why these studies have progressed the way that they have with additional FDA oversight, why the FDA is also signaling that we're, getting closer to them being ready to make a final determination and ruling. My guess is that we will probably be in a place of having some type of ruling by the FDA, probably in late 2024 or early 2025. Be my best guess. We're probably closer in terms of when MDMA therapy for PTSD will be approved. That's likely to be probably in the first half of 2024. So we're probably going to see the door open with MDMA therapy, and then within a year of that, probably psilocybin therapy for depression.
What kind of studies are you currently working on? What are are you just sort of doing bigger versions of things you've already done, or are you doing like new types of studies answering different types of questions?
So I'm more on the latter. I'm interested in a couple of different areas of research. The first one that we've started now is we've launched a psilocybin trial for veterans with PTSD. There has not yet been a study of psilocybin in PTSD in general yet, and specifically not one yet in veterans. And so we're working on that trial right now at Ohio State University. We also just got funding to launch a comparison study of 5-MeO-DMT and psilocybin therapy in lung cancer patients. And so we're going to be launching that trial in early 2024. And then in addition to that, I have several pilot studies that are underway right now that we've been working on for the last couple of years to start to bring together minority and underrepresented populations more closely into psychedelic therapy research. And so we're likely in the next year or two going to be launching trials in gender and sexual minority individuals, looking at minority stress and the effect of that on mental health, and using the psychedelic therapy as treatment for dealing with stigma and the negative outcomes of being in a marginalized group. We've also been working on translating all of the psychedelic measures into Spanish so we can reduce the barrier of language for people getting into these studies, because it's been predominantly English language studies. And so that's hopefully going to increase access and availability to people. And then we've also been doing studies looking at BIPOC and other people of the global majority, and kind of racial trauma, and the way in which just being in kind of a racial or ethnically diverse group kind of confers its own type of depressive and traumatic kind of reactions to being marginalized in society. And so in all three of those different areas, we're hoping in the coming years with funding to be able to launch studies.
And so you mentioned the study using psilocybin and 5-MeO in patients with lung cancer. Is that to treat like end of life anxiety?
Yeah, so that'll be treating kind of the anxiety and depression that's associated with receiving a life-threatening illness diagnosis.
And just for those who don't know, what sort of results have we seen for that type of thing so far?
Yeah, so cancer or life-threatening illness in general were some of the first large trials that were published with the kind of looking at psilocybin therapy. They were published in 2016 by researchers at Hopkins and New York University, and those studies were really the first out there that showed in this population of cancer patients that this psychedelic therapy helped to reduce and in some cases kind of completely put into remission anxiety and depression, and was increasing the quality of life among folks that had these life-threatening illness diagnoses. For some, kind of help them live more meaningful lives with whatever life they had left, and kind of deal with things like death anxiety and existential distress and other phenomenologic things that occur just getting that diagnosis. And so it's in fact some of the reason why there was a push to then pursue it more in just depression in general, as opposed to just depression that shows up related to this very unique type of medical condition, but just to see whether it could be helpful in general with depression and anxiety.
Is there anything that you want to reiterate for people about what we discussed today, or any final thoughts you have about psilocybin-assisted therapy or psychedelic-assisted therapy in general?
I like to say to people right now that there's a lot of momentum building in this space. There's a lot of really exciting studies that are being published, it seems like every day lately, about the potential benefits here. It's important for people to remember that all of these studies are using psychedelics in the context of, highly selectively, chosen people, and they're all getting extensive psychotherapy and preparation and integration. And so, while we're still in this place of having to wait for FDA approval and having this treatment available, in some place local to you, there's still a lot of interest, and people are really wanting to get access to this as soon as possible. And unfortunately, that's led to, unscrupulous and unethical providers out there who are, willing to give people drugs without any other type of support and preparation and screening and oversight. And so people are being harmed by that, in part because of all the demand that's being generated from this work. So I would just encourage people to, take some time to let this play out. Let's get through FDA approval. Let's get kind of closer to this being available for people. Or if people are gonna, pursue it because they don't want to wait, or things are too difficult to wait longer, then please make sure that you're working with trusted folks, that you're working with people who are engaging, who have protocols in place to screen you, to make sure that you're a good fit, that have protocols in place to provide preparation and integration support. And the good places out there that are doing this now, before it's legal in the US, they're still implementing a lot of the same things that you see or hear about in the trials. They're implementing preparation, even if it's only a couple of hours. They're still meeting with people ahead of time to ask them questions to make sure they're still a good fit. Like, all of those things are just really good elements of harm reduction and benefit enhancement. So I just encourage people to still seek out, if they are going to still seek out those elements and make sure that they're working with trusted folks.
All right. Well, Dr. Alan Davis, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks so much.